Back, everybody. If you're just joining us for the DUI virtual trade show, welcome. We've been going on for a day and a half of these now. We're coming down to the last two sessions of the day. And I'd like to remind everybody that's watching on Facebook Live that there's a link there that you can actually join us on Zoom. The Zoom feature lets you actually go into breakout rooms with the different DUI staff if you so desire. And throughout today's presentation, if you have any questions, please ask them. If they are in line with the presentation, we'll ask them, our presenter right at that time, or we'll ask them at the end of the presentation also. So with that, welcome. And I'd like to introduce our speaker again is the same as earlier today. That is Pete Nawrocky. So Pete, welcome, and you're presenting on OMS Regulators. So just do a quick, again, brief intro, just in case people are just joining us.
Yeah, well, I've been saying for the first two sessions, it was all about you. Well, now it's all about me. So putting it simply, yes, I'm still an active instructor. I've been teaching since '79. I'm an active diver. I enjoy working with people. I like getting in the water with anybody. I started with my daughter when she was 10, and I'm looking forward to get my granddaughter in the water. And I'm just enjoying sharing the technology that has grown over time. I've been in the business since '76, so it's changed quite a bit in a way. The best thing I ever heard from Archie Orenstein, who I worked for at Central Skin Divers, and for some of you, that's like a bell just went off, because that was the biggest shop back in the 70s and 80s. His best line was "Time marches backwards." So there are always been changes. So what we're going to look at now is some of the breathing systems that DUI has, that OMS has, that DUI is distributing. And I try to not to do a lot of death by PowerPoint, but sometimes it's just a little bit easier. So, but for those of you, that's my contact information. So if you have questions after this or later on, because usually what happens, all of a sudden it's that aha moment. There's my email. There's my phone number. That's my cell phone. No, don't call me at 3 a.m. The phone will be off. So I'm wise to that one, or I'll just ignore you. So let me know if you need anything, and we'll go from there. The OMS regulator. There is an overbalanced first stage. And as you're reading what's on the screen over here, a simple balanced diaphragm design has been around, by the way, actually started with the Conshelf experiments. That was the regulator that was designed there. And that was a balanced diaphragm design. An overbalanced regulator actually has a larger orifice on the inside, on the low pressure side, to allow more gas to get through down to the diver, irregardless of depth, irregardless of the intermediate pressure of the regulator. So it's going to perform pretty much until your tank is dry at this point. But you're not going to do that, because to be up on the boat before you hit 500 psi. But you have a good design in the first stage, give you plenty of air. So let's look at what we're working with now. Now the picture that Jack had up there, that was from the 2018 model we had. That was chrome-plated brass. The new one, the Airstream, is actually passive. They use a PVD coating. And the way they put a PVD coating on, we still have chrome-plated brass, but they will either heat or mechanically inject whatever substrate that they want, and it will impregnate the metal at this point and bond with it. This is a gunmetal finish. This is what's used in industrial finishes. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't corrode. It maintains the color. I'm sure you've seen some products out there that when you're using it enough times, rubbing it with your hand, it actually will rub away the black coating on there, because they basically just coated it, but they didn't use the same PVD process, which is much more expensive and extends the longevity on there. Now, what we did on the first stage, and even on the original design, there are 4 low pressure ports. They are angled down 30 degrees, 23 degrees forward. We'll look at an actual regulator with the hoses on it, so you can just see that in a little bit. And 2 high pressure ports angled down at 45 degrees. The whole idea of this is to keep the hose routing as low and as clean as possible. So if you're overhead environments, or if you're working as a public safety diver and you're worried about it getting entangled into branches and stuff, this is actually going to keep the hoses down on your shoulder. You won't have that big hula hoop sticking out on the side to entangle anything. It'll sit lower and cleaner. And if you're wearing a full face mask and you put a 70 or a 90-degree angle on your full face mask, it'll come up clean and smooth under your arm. Once again, keeping that entanglement hazard down at that point. And it comes in, and it also comes in the yoke assembly. So you have your choice on which way you want to work with it. Now, all these regulators are not, it's actually not EAN 250. If you look on the regulator, it's EAN 250A. The difference between a 250 and a 250A is right here. Basically, if you go to your secondary regulator, whether you want to call it an octopus rig or say second stage, it's going to perform the same at depth. You'll get the air at depth so that your buddy won't be starving for air. It will work in temperatures down to 10 degrees. Now, they do this on surface testing in the lower temperatures, but you can reach 10 degrees on the inside temporarily, because as you're breathing through the regulator, you're going from high pressure to low pressure, and that will cause a drop in pressure. Any one of you who's left the tank valve open, you'll notice that it ices over. And I won't get into the point how you've reached dew point and stuff, but I will tell you one thing. That icing over has nothing to do with the water content inside that scuba tank. It has everything to do with the dew point and the relative humidity on the outside. Yes, earth science is still real. You should have paid attention in high school. So that's going to wind up frosting over. And what will happen inside of a regulator is that if there is moisture involved and the airflow is restricted in any way, you'll wind up getting a freezing situation. So we've basically addressed that to try to keep it so that when you want to do your ice dive, you're there, you're good, you're not going to have a problem with it. All right. All the regulators, by the way, are environmentally sealed. So you do have that extra diaphragm on the outside, and we use an air chamber. We don't put oil on the inside. It's an air chamber, so you don't have to worry about any kind of contaminant at this point. Now, the second regulator, and Jack, this probably wind up being a relatively short presentation. So we'll go through questions also, but the Compact C, and I'll get into the nitty gritty in a little bit, is a conventional design. It's still overbalanced, just as the Airstream is, but it uses the conventional layout and the hose routing that you're used to seeing. It is built with 4 low pressure ports and 2 high pressure ports. This regulator, I happen to like this when I'm using it for a bailout. I'll actually use it for side mount diving. It's something that works well for me. It also works well for a deco bottle regulator. Now, here's the big thing for folks that are working on regulators. All of the OMS regulators from 2018 on use the exact same parts kit. All of the torque settings are exactly the same. So when I teach a class and taught you on the one that was, for lack of a better term, silver, the chrome-plated brass, it's the same procedure when you're working on the one with the PVD coating. So you won't have to make any changes there. So whatever parts kit you bought for your shop, we're now selling the PVD coated ones. You don't have to worry about making a change of procedure, tools, or what you need to have. The second stage, and everybody likes to see the inside of the second stage. So I got you guys a blow up to look at on the inside. It is a balanced design. This should look pretty familiar for those of you who've been rebuilding regulators over a period of time. So you do have a balanced chamber on the inside, and the regulator is lightweight. It works well. It does what it's designed to do, but it does have a couple of extra features. Okay. There's actually, and I'll get into this physically so you can see it in a little bit, but there's a little hinge door on the back. So if you wind up in a situation, and I'm sure this has happened to everybody that winds up teaching a class, that somebody now winds up, I'm breathing water. It's like, okay, if the mouthpiece doesn't have a hole in it, what you do have to worry about is the fact that that little exhaust diaphragm might have gotten flipped over or pushed in. That usually happens when they suck in too hard or they're bouncing around the regulator. It's not, rental people that use a rental gear always have the same attitude. It's not mine, so they don't care how much they get slammed around. You can actually be in the water, pop the back door open with a blunt tip knife and fix it there, lock it down and go, because the exhaust tee is actually built into the second stage. There is a dive and pre-dive switch that's easy to get to even while wearing dry gloves. And the adjustment knob, there's actually a cam built into it, so that when you're turning it down, what we have is a lot of people, the regulator starts to free flow, and the first thing they see, there's a knob. And I'm going to turn that knob down until this thing stops free flowing. Well, what happens is in some designs, you'll turn that thing down and you will jam it down tight enough, you'll actually damage the seat. We built in a clutch, so it'll only go so far and lock off. So that's going to extend the life. And regulators free flow for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that there is too much schmutz, dirt, sand, whatever you want to call it, in the second stage, causes the lever arm to get pushed down. Or you have an overpressure problem in the first stage of the regulator, and nothing's going to stop that except having it overhaul at that point. So you do have the first and second stage. Now, one thing about our second stages, they are actually tuned to breathe a little, for lack of a better term, stiffer than the primary second stage, and that's by design, so that they will free flow less. You'll get more than enough air to breathe out of it, but it is going to be a little tighter when you first start breathing on it, but you get more than enough to take care of you. And you can dive them on the ice. I mean, right now I'm diving in 45-degree water, 60 feet, no problem, swimming around, tooling around. I'm not getting free flow problems at all. So it is designed, and EAN 250 is what you're looking for. EAN 250A, like we have stamped. That's stamped right on that. You can't just stamp it on. It has to pass CE testing in order to put it on there. So if it's got it, you're good to go. So and going back just for the fun of it, let's see if we can back up here. It probably can't. All right. Let's take a look at the next thing, because then we're going to get off this death by PowerPoint and work a different way. Our gauges, the pressure gauges, are made with mineral glass, and the industry standard is one thickness. We deliberately make things 1.5 times thicker than the industry standard, and that's deliberate, so that these gauges will work for the people that want to go at 300 or 400 feet. What most people don't realize, the interior box that holds all the fittings that are playing with that 3,000 PSI, there's not 3,000 PSI in the case. That's actually at 1 atmosphere where they're put together. And then as they descend, what'll happen is the face will crack and it'll flood. Well, 1.5 times thicker, mineral glass is very resistant to scratch resistance. If you saw the ones I'm diving with, it looks like they're brand new. Now, I don't drag my gauges all over, and the biggest abuse of a gauge is actually on the surface, where when the diver's getting dressed or the mates are moving it around, it's not their fault. It's just naturally going to happen. Those gauges are slamming against the tank. They're slamming against the side of the boat. Some people, if you're careless, I always dive with a 22-inch length hose on my pressure gauge to keep it high and tucked up. I unclip it, bring it to the front, read it, and put it back down again. So it keeps it from getting scratched and banging in or getting entangled in the coral or on a wreck or anything else. When we sell the gauges, by the way, we sell them. They come as you see them with the little swivel spool on there. We don't sell them with the hoses. So if you have a hose length you're diving with, there's nothing with the hose. This is pretty much standard. You just have to make sure that you lubricate those O-rings that are on there. And we also actually sell those little pieces separately if you use them. And if you're using them on oxygen, you can't clean the inside of the gauge, but you really should lubricate those O-rings with a proper lubricant, crystal lube, tribal lube, something that's designed to work in that type of environment. Lock it down and then make it work. Now, the gauges come in different sizes. The 2.5-inch gauge and the 2-inch gauge use the mineral glass. Then we have what's called the Slimline Gauge. And the Slimline Gauge, that's a plastic face. Everybody's seen that style gauge. It's available from everybody, okay? That's usually what you won't see on somebody for their main gas. They'll wind up using that on a pony bottle. They'll wind up using on a deco bottle, maybe on a small 6-inch hose that's on there. That gauge, and the way you extend the life on the face of that gauge is to make sure that it's facing toward the tank, not away from the tank, so that while you're coming back up to the boat or swimming in through the wreck, you're not scratching the face up and really beating it up. Some people like to use the hose and fold it up. There's a lot of different ways, but that has a plastic face, and they scratch, period. I'm not going to lie to you. They do scratch, but they're an inexpensive gauge. The other, and it is a chrome-plated brass body, but on the entire gauge, on the OMS gauge, everything is chrome-plated brass. It's a heavy gauge. So it's going to tend to last longer for you at that point. Now I'm going to get out of this before Jack throws me out of it, because he's good at that. Okay, so let's take a look at the first stage and at the hose routing. So you can see from the front, everything's going to be tight coming over the diver's body. And by the way, the hoses that we have, these are custom hoses. These are MyFlex hoses. They are made by MyFlex, and this is a custom color pattern for OMS, which is black, which is basically gray with the red stripe on it. And we have that in high pressure and low pressure. So you've got your primary, and even when I put it toward the front, you'll notice that the hose tends to stay low. It's going to sit right on your shoulder. The secondary, if you want a 40-inch hose, you can work with that, and we differentiate it by the different color. On the opposite side, I have a BC hose on here, which you could use MyFlex, whatever you want. I have a rubber hose on mine, and the high pressure hose, which you can see is thinner, and of course the pressure gauge on here. Now, for those of you that are new to this, you'll notice low pressure hoses are wider than the high pressure hoses, because the high pressure hoses is basically, there's no volume going through that. If you split a high pressure hose, an aluminum 80 will take almost 40 minutes to drain through a high pressure hose. Even though it's coming out at 3,000 PSI and gradually dwindling down, you don't have the volume. If you split a low pressure hose, you can empty an aluminum 80 in under 2 minutes. And you can see this yourself at the end of one of your dives. Just push down and let the regulator free flow. You can watch your pressure gauge start to stop. Take the second stage off and just let it blow through. You'll really watch that pressure gauge drop, okay? But don't be careful when you do that, and make sure you're doing it in the pool, and don't go down to 0 and surface before it winds up blowing all the air out. So this is, a gauge that's going to last longer for you at that point, because it is a chrome-plated brass with the mineral glass on it. And here is just for size comparison how small these particular gauges are. Now, this is DIN, and it was interesting. I was reading a lot, and we're all on Facebook, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But DIN versus Yoke. Okay, Yoke is used a lot in the United States, and there is nothing wrong with the Yoke regulator. Period. They work. DIN has become the choice in technical diving because the O-ring is actually captured on the inside of the valve itself, whereas you all know this, on a Yoke regulator, it actually sits on the outside on the face. And if you bang the knob hard enough on the Yoke, there is potential of breaking the seal. So it's real simple. Don't do that. Don't go into overhead environments. They've switched to DIN for overhead environments because the hose routing is cleaner. There's nothing in the back. There's nothing on the top to make it fit. And if you do bang it, chances are you're not going to break the seal at that point. So either one works. The performance of the regulator is exactly the same. All right. On the first stage, we talked about also that little diaphragm on here that you don't open the regulator up to see what's in there. If there's nothing in there, don't have to look, okay? It's just a nut on the inside. So don't play with that because it will affect the performance on your regulator, particularly at depth, and you could wind up with a freeze-up problem. So stay out of it. If you really want to know about it, take an equipment specialist class. They'll take their regulator apart instead of yours. So what a lot of people like to do, they want to see what's on the inside. So we're going to start on the outside first. Here's the knob. You got your dive, free dive switch, and we actually have it. It says plus and minus on it. So the minus is to cut down on free flow. You put it in plus when you want to breathe on it. Personally, and I do dive a tech configuration, my regulator's under the neck. This is always on the negative at that point to cut down on free flow. Now, the little knob on the side, where do you set that? Well, if you leave it open all the way, there's a greater chance for free flow, and this will just wind up stopping, okay? And by the way, use the tips of your fingers. Don't use your hand, okay? Tips of your fingers, it stops, no problem. Now, when you're turning it down, you can hear the cam. Once you hear the cam, you stop. That's it. And now chances are you're not going to have any free flow problems. So that's how I leave my regulator sit. Everything tuned down. I can still breathe out of it if something goes wrong. My buddy comes up, takes my other regulator out of your mouth, because by the way, that's what they do. They don't do this. They just take whatever's here because they know that one works because you're using it. And it's just simply put this in my mouth. I can breathe, and then I can readjust the knob quick. And that's why you practice. So every time you see those guys and gals and they're diving at your local quarry and they're wearing doubles, you really don't need all that. They're practicing their skills in case they wind up in a situation they have to share air. This becomes second nature in order for them to get it in and out of their mouth at that point. So there's different configurations that'll work that way. Okay. On the inside, now you know that I said this. I don't have a quarter in my pocket, so I might have to take a 30-second break in a moment and go find a quarter somewhere or a knife tip in order to work with. The show you how the back pops open. So you're overworking me, Jack. I didn't have a big enough gap. I went and took a nap. So here's the inside. Isn't that interesting? It's basically pretty standard through the industry. We didn't reinvent the wheel, and that's deliberate so that technicians actually will pretty much recognize what's on the inside and how that's exactly going to work. So let's see if I got a. All right, I have a blunt tip knife. As though I was an instructor in the water, there is a little slot. You basically just turn it, just a little click, pops open, and now you can access the diaphragm on the inside in case it gets dirty or jammed up. Now, for those of you in the days of yore, we used to be for cave diving, we only wanted a regulator that you can actually take the cover off and clean it underwater in case it's filled up with sand. Well, that's because originally the 5 or 7 foot hose was clipped off to your side. It might have dragged behind you. You were breathing off the short hose. I just dated myself. That's from the early 80s. Okay. We have since changed, and now we breathe off the long hose, and this regulator is up around your neck. Now, for those of you just getting started into this, the regulator should be here. You just pick it up and just slide it into your mouth, and that holds the position. If that regulator on that bungee is hanging down here, that means when you're in a horizontal position, if this is your head, it's hanging down here and it's slamming into everything you're swimming over. So when you do an air change on the water, it's not hand your buddy the other regulator and then take this thing and stretch it out and look at it. It hasn't moved since you started the dive. So just take it and slide it right into your mouth, and there it goes. It keeps it up under your neck just enough so that when you look down, you barely feel the regulator that stays out of the way. Okay. And I get to say all that stuff because I'm an instructor trainer. So there you go. You just took a class and know you're not getting certified. So deal with it. There's an extra lockdown on the inside. And then this piece just locks down on the top. And that's going to wind up holding that in position. Jack, you got some questions? You always do.
First, I need to question you on a technical term you used earlier. What is schmutz?
Oh, well, I'm obviously not a local boy. I'm in Virginia Beach, but I come from New York. So schmutz is garbage.
So, so the silliness aside, there was a question about polar diving with the regulator. How's it rated for below freezing conditions?
Well, with EN250A, it should be compatible with those types of conditions. I haven't dove it personally. So Dick, if you're listening, you need to send Jack and I to the Antarctic to test dive equipment. Okay, Jack, I tried. All right. But when we're thinking in terms of diving, we are looking at the sport diving community. There are certain things, and if you've ever been ice diving before, most regulators will work in the ice diving environment and in cold water environment. And in the Antarctic, I know talking to people, you're dealing with 28-degree water. Now, I used to change props. I used to change on ships that were icebound when I was a little younger, and never had a problem with the freeze up of the regulator because there were certain things I did to guarantee that. The first thing was I didn't breathe out of the regulator on the surface because surface air, you're going to put moisture into it. Air's cold, chance of a freeze up at that point. So I wouldn't breathe out of the regulator until my face was completely immersed in the water. It's a good thing to make sure the valve is open all the way. And then it was short, even breaths. Now, for years, they didn't have antifreeze protection. And the real trick on to keep your regulator from freezing up is making sure that the supply air is as dry as possible. So if you're getting dragon breath or dragon mouth while you're making the dives, yes, the air is extremely dry. So EN250A, we discussed in the beginning, should be able to meet those requirements. I can't say from personal experience, but they're built to EN250A to allow for that type of an environment.
Okay, the next question was about the Compact C. Is there a fifth low pressure port?
There are 4 low pressure ports, 2 high pressure ports.
So it also does not have the rotating turret. So it's
no
fixed,
rotating turret.
Fixed position.
Yes.
So just so everyone knows, even though we have these black and red MyFlex hoses, there is a yellow OMS MyFlex hose that we do also offer.
Yes, that's a 39-inch hose.
Right, it's a default length, so it's one thing only. So another question is there a conversion kit for the DIN to Yoke or vice versa?
Actually, there's 2 ways of looking at that. If you own a DIN regulator, there's a DIN to Yoke adapter, which is only 300 bar. There are no 400 bar Yokes. There was at one point in the industry, but not anymore. It's 300 bar. So that's going to fit on your aluminum 80 or whatever. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you realize it, but Luxfer stopped making aluminum tanks in the United States. So that's a story for another day. So save your cylinders. But we're working in the US at 3,000 PSI. So there is a DIN to Yoke adapter. The drawback on the DIN to Yoke adapter, it actually moves the first stage further away from the cylinder. And some people, if you're wearing a cylinder too high, it'll bang you in the back of the head. Now, the ideal position, by the way, for a first stage, there is a position for a first stage. It's supposed to be even with your shoulders, which puts it within that respiratory cycle when you're in the horizontal position so that the regulator is sensing ambient pressure at the same level where the second stage is going to breathe, so it makes it easier. So if you're wearing it higher, you won't feel a lot, but ideally, it should be pretty much to the top of your shoulders, which is an advantage of wearing a harness style BC, because when you're on the surface and you set the harness up, the way you stand up is the way that the unit will be in the water. Now, with Yoke is going to move it just slightly, not by a lot. So that'll work there for you, but there is no adapter kit for that. That is a conversion. You would actually have to take off, it's called a DIN connector, take that off and then replace that with a complete other unit that has a different nut, which must be torqued down. Torquing is extremely important to make sure that it stay there and locked down, because the O-rings underneath the DIN connector and the O-ring that hold the fitting that holds the yoke in place is not in your Save a Dive kit. It's only available in a rebuild kit for the regulators. So it has to be torqued down properly. And over torquing is just as bad as under torquing. And you can't torque by holding it. Oh yeah, I know what 22 inch-pounds is. I just squeeze a little bit longer. It doesn't work that way. You need to use a torque wrench.
Okay, so the next question is training or education on or being certified for doing service on these regulators.
Okay. If you are a DUI OMS dealer in good standing and supporting the line, we do have a class. Now, I've had to be, let's just say, I've had to learn to dance in order to make this happen. And I've done it a different way. I do not want teach. I don't teach classes where I'm going to give you a PowerPoint and we're going to talk about it on Skype or Zoom, and you're going to do what's called a parts changing monkey class, which means you take the regulator apart, you put it back together, and you're done. The way I work with dealers, and you have to be working with a dealer, and the dealer has to say you're allowed to take the class, I will mail a first and second stage to the shop. And it's going to come with, there's 2 proprietary tools to make sure you're not scratching the daylights out of somebody's regulator when you're rebuilding it. It will come with parts kits. We will together, usually via Skype, take the regulators apart. We will do it together. You will then put the regulator back together. You'll have the replacement parts in front of you. You will use the proper torque settings. I'll send a list of all the tools that you need in order to take the class. We will do the rebuild right there together. You will tune it live. And if there's a problem, we will solve those problems. 90% of the problems are improper torquing. So I will actually be working the same way I'm working with you with DEMA is the same way I wind up running this class. And I've already got classes booked right through the end of March. So if you want something, it'll probably have to be in May. So we can do it. It doesn't take a long time. If you worked on regulators before, and I'm down to a couple of people, I usually knock it off in an hour and a half, 2 hours. If you've never rebuilt the regulator, this is something that we need to discuss, because you really have to know how to work with the tools properly in order to do it. It's not really expensive. We don't do this to make a lot of money, but we have to make sure that we're basically covering the costs of everything involved, the tools, the parts kit, and the shipping the regulators back and forth. That and a nice bottle of bourbon for me on occasion makes me very happy.
So just a little clarification, I guess, on the EN 250A, it's the temperatures go down to 4 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
So, which is slightly above the temperatures that would be at the Antarctic, I guess. So next question is on that hose routing. I know that I have heard some people with the jacket BCDs that the hose routing is angled down too far for them. Obviously, the answer is where the tank in the proper position.
Or switch to a compact C. I mean, when we're looking at our configuration, and it's almost impossible to build something that's going to be perfect for everybody. Okay, this particular style setup really works ideally with a back inflation unit where you're wearing a harness and a back unit, whether you're wearing singles or doubles, because you can get the hose routing down tight and close to your body. It really comes down in that case. And what happens with a lot of people, I'm not being negative, okay, is the fact that when they're wearing stabilizing jackets up on the surface, they tend to wear them where the regulator winds up between their shoulder blades. And as I told you, down too low. It needs to be a little bit higher at this point. Now, there is another option for some folks. On my personal rig, I dive this way. My primary, when I'm doing open water diving, I'm diving with a bunch of friends, nothing fancy, nothing technical. I actually put a 70 or a 90 degree angle on here and I route the hose underneath my arm. That's my primary, not this one, the black one. And the secondary is around my neck. So if I had to share air, I just basically hand it out, and that hose just unfolds from under my arm. And if I am using a 5 or a 7 foot hose, it's going to do the normal routing down front of my chest, around myself, and back into my mouth. And that's where this regulator really does well, because it keeps that long hose really, like you can see, snug and close to the diver's body at this point. So the hose is gonna come down, and then you'll bring it up and around at that point. And that would work even with a stabilizing jacket using a longer hose.
Okay, so the next question has to do with color. Because some people were watching the thing on all the different colors of our wings. Are the second stages coming in other colors? You showed a red one and a yellow one. Obviously, yellow is the octo color.
Or say second stage.
So are there other color options?
Not today. And I know Thomas is here. He's probably taking notes. So on that, it would probably be, and what I would hope he would do, I can't answer for him, but my answer for that would be to have extra covers that you could buy separately. So that we'll see. He might have already thought about this, or it'll be coming out of DEMA, but I haven't heard anything as of yet.
Okay, so just so you know, I'm kind of left out of the loop on what's coming up. So if I filter one of these questions through that way, it's not like
yeah, no, it's all cool.
Okay.
I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
So another question has to do with the venturi and the adjustment valve. When it's closed, is it actually closed, or can they still breathe off from it?
Oh, no. Okay. Never closed. Reduced, but never closed. You can't in good conscience put a diver in the water where if he or she has a problem, or their buddy comes over and she has to hand off a second stage to somebody, and now he or she has to now start manipulating knobs and switches in order to breathe. No, you can breathe. What that does is reduces the chances of the regulator free flowing, particularly when you're dealing with heavy current. That's where you want it for. That's the reason there. But the answer is no, it's not going to take it down to zero. It'll be reduced, but it'll never be down to zero.
So I guess the stainless steel color, that's a color that is being phased out, and it's all going to be the black PVD.
Yeah, it's actually chrome plated brass, and we used originally, it was a brushed chrome on the top, and then the shiny chrome around the environmental cap. Well, the regulator fundamentally hasn't changed, but now we're using the PVD coating on it in order to extend the life. And it does, for lack of a better term, it makes it cosmetically nicer on the regulator. So I'm diving with the silver one, and Dan, I'll be buying a black one, so take note. So I just switched the hoses over because I like the color scheme on this.
So is there a difference between the yoke and the din in the closed? Maybe this is more not a regulator question, but more of a general question for the cold water diving.
No, they perform exactly the same.
Well, I mean, it's more of the din and yoke connection, not necessarily the regulator itself.
There'd be no change. It's just that once it's sealed, the airflow is going to be exactly the same. So there won't be any change there. The only difference is if you're ice diving, you'd probably be a little bit better off using a DIN connection, because if you do bang the back of the tank on the ice surface, that's like hitting a rock half the time. You do have to worry about dislodging at that point. So, but the reason why yoke is so prevalent, and yoke, chances are, will never go away, and there's never a problem owning a yoke regulator. Most resorts are set up for yoke regulators. They do have the cylinders down there, the valves, where you can actually use a 6 or 7, depending on the manufacturer, take out a fitting on the inside and put the DIN on the inside. But most folks are taught with yoke regulators. So that's going to stay. The DIN The DIN is more by a matter of choice on how you want your personal configuration. So I'm a DIN guy.
Yeah. So myself, I'm also a DIN regulator person. And when I do travel, I do have to bring the DIN, the Yoke adapter. Whereas places where they did not have the the tanks that were set up for that, an example would have been Cuba. They definitely did not have DIN tanks, and you had to have that adapter.
Yeah. Well, I was down in Bonaire. They were set up for Yoke on everything, but I looked down and there was the bushing on the inside, and just popped it out, put my regulator on, and I'm good to go. The other advantage, there are certain advantages when you are diving a DIN regulator, particularly if you're a side mount diver. There's, depending on how you have your regulator configured, if the regulator is facing out or up, facing up to your body, everybody has their own. There's no wrong way as far as I'm concerned, as long as you're not dragging hoses all over. There's not an extra knob over here to bang into your body or to push on something else if you're going into a tight area.
Just so you know, there's a lot of Facebook groups would disagree that.
I know that. I know that. That's why it's like, yeah, they jump up and down, but you know, side mount's not a religion. It's just a different way of wearing a set of double cylinders. So, you know, just don't go anywhere. You can't get stuck. Keep your feet flat, one hose around your neck, and keep your feet up. That was my side mount class.
So those are the questions I have for now. So if you're okay, unless you can think of anything else to talk about with the regulators, I think we've covered most of that. So let's go into a break. And again, to remind everybody, the Zoom session will keep running, so you can always ask questions there, and we'll address them. I will stop the Facebook Live portion of it. And so those of you watching Facebook Live, be aware it will end, and then I will start the new session a few minutes before we start it at 2 o'clock. So thank you, Pete. Thanks for sharing about the regulators. And next up will be the OMS accessories. So thanks, Pete.
Yeah, I'll be back.